to me, drug policy ought to be in the business of trying to reduce harm. There are times when the policy itself is what is creating or magnifying the harm.
So I'm with Dr. Joseph Spillane, the associate dean, the professor in the history department, and he was until recently the associate dean of student affairs in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and director of the Academic Advising Center. And you've also published really cool books. I at least took a look at them. One is Cocaine, From Medical Marvel to Modern Menace in the United States. Another one is Coxsackie, The Life and Death of Prison Reform. And you've co-authored and co-edited more books like involving in history of criminal justice system and federal drug control. Yep. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
That's my pleasure. It's really good to be able to talk to you.
Yes. So something I've been wondering is, what are drugs and why have you gotten an interest in investigating those?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so those are both very good questions. My interest, as you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a historian by training, right? So my interest is in our historical experiences with drugs as a social phenomenon. So when I say that I study drugs, I mean that in a very particular way, right? In the broadest sense, drugs are simply substances, right, that cause an effect on the body. And so pharmacologically, drugs have a very broad and comprehensive kind of meaning, and they include all sorts of substances. But as you probably know, right, when people talk about drugs, it's very much specific to a particular context. So, for example, when people talk about the drug industry, they're talking about companies that produce pharmaceuticals, right, for medical purposes. When people talk about the drug problem, they're talking about something else, right? They're talking typically about drugs that are used illicitly or that exist in the black market, or that are perceived to have widespread negative social consequences. As a historian, I would say my primary interest is in that latter definition of drugs. I'm not a pharmaceutical historian per se. I'm really interested in those substances that at various times society has identified as social problems, as medical problems, as public health problems, as cultural problems. These are the things that I'm interested in. And if you're interested, I can tell you how I actually got started in this area. So I'm a big believer when I train historians or when I teach undergraduates in history classes. I'm a big believer in keeping an open mind to whatever historical problems come along. In other words, I have encountered at times students who have a fairly narrow view of what they're interested in. And my feeling has always been that the best way to approach, frankly, history and life is to keep a very open mind to what might be interesting. And I suspect, for example, that anybody that has a podcast has a fairly open mind to what might be interesting.
I try
and you you jump around to disparate topics because you realize what you might find
Absolutely.
in those. So in any event, I that's how I've always tried to approach my work as a historian, which is to keep an open mind and not to limit myself to what I think initially might be interesting, but to be aware of what could be. So many years ago, as a graduate student, my dissertation advisor was approached about doing some work on our historical experiences in the United States with cocaine when it was a legal substance. And there were researchers who were doing policy assessments of cocaine and its control in a contemporary sense and in a comparative sense internationally, but were aware that there was a historical experience as well. They looked into it, couldn't find anything. Nothing really substantively had been done on it. So they approached my advisor and said, "Well, would you be interested in doing something for us?" And he said, "Well, no, not really, but I have a student who might find this interesting." So simply presented to me, and I was asked, "Well, if you're interested, there's some funds to make this possible, and we pay for you to go do your research and simply put, find out what happened when cocaine was a legal drug in the United States. We want to know, what was that like? How did that go?" And I said, "Sure, I'll go ahead and do that." And that eventually turned into a dissertation project. And as you mentioned, it turned into a book. But it was all because I kind of kept an open mind about what might be interesting. And so this was, my goodness, over 30 years ago.
A couple of years ago.
It was over 30 years ago. And at the time, the field of drug history was fairly small. There weren't many people doing it. But I'm pleased to say now, after 30 years, the field has become so robust and so many really outstanding people doing work in it. But that's how that started.
And did you get some sort of pushback when you started? Because I imagine drugs can be some sort of controversial topic. Yeah. So just the matter of not studying even drugs, but the history of drugs.
Sure.
Did you ever encounter some sort of pushback or criticism of why would you be studying this?
Yeah, that's a great
thing that's
question.
not valuable for society?
I would say that when I started, it would have been perceived as a kind of weird thing.
Okay.
for a historian to study, because very few had. And so, sure, yeah, there's no question that people did a little bit of a double take when they heard what I was doing and why are you doing that? But there were two really, I will just say there were a couple of really encouraging aspects, though. One was my dissertation advisor, Steve Schlossman, who liked weird history. He liked doing things that most people weren't doing. And so he was very encouraging and very supportive. And then there was the fact that while there were very few historians working in this field, and this would be now, I'm talking about maybe say 1990, 91, 92, as I'm getting into this work. At the start of the 1990s, while there were very few historians doing drug history, drugs as an issue were enormously significant at the time. And so what I benefited from was the public interest in the topic and the policy interest in the topic. And I found myself doing something that historians don't always get to do, which is to talk to a lot of non-historian audiences. And that, I think, was, for me, the most energizing and exciting part about starting work in this area when I did. Because the drug war and drugs as an issue were, they were very near the top of the American policy agenda in the early 1990s. There was just no shortage of audiences who were interested in the work that I was doing. And so that was...
And that's actually something that I wanted to ask you maybe later, but I can ask you now, since you're mentioning that. What is the value for a historian to talk to people? Because I imagine when I think of historians just reading their books, maybe some historical papers or like mostly tales that people have told over the years and written down. But does talking to the people in real time, or maybe people that lived those historical events, does that bring value? And because probably, as you were mentioning, like you were kind of seeing history unfold, right? And you were like seeing people that maybe were impacted by the whole policy against drugs, and were you getting those positive and negative opinions on the policies?
There's a lot in that question. You managed to pack a lot into one question, but I will. So let me just say that first of all, there is, on a personal level, there's so much value in talking with people, in presenting your work as a historian to audiences of non-historians. And we all in our own areas talk to each other. But I think that sometimes when we talk to each other, there's kind of an assumption of, well, sure, of course your work is valuable, and of course it's interesting. So if I go to a conference with a bunch of other historians and I stand up and talk, they're likely to mostly nod along and say, well, gee, that was very interesting. When I was a graduate student starting out, talking to audiences of non-historians, right, there's no assumption that history is useful. Right? If I'm talking to a room full of political scientists or economists, I need to convince them that this is useful and relevant. Yeah. If I'm talking to folks from the policy arena, right, I need to begin by convincing them that history is important and useful. And so what I mean to say is that for my own development as a historian, I think there's very little that I could have done that was more useful than talking to people who needed to be convinced that what I was doing was significant, because it forced me to think about those questions, right? If we only talk to each other, then we never really have to think about it, because we all take for granted that what we do is important. Yeah. But when we go outside of those networks and we talk with other people who don't take it for granted, then you have to really work yourself to think through what the implications are. So part of the answer to your question is I think it's made me a better historian for having had all of those conversations. And then, as you say, too, the interesting thing about studying drugs in the middle of the drug war in the early 1990s was you were always conscious of the fact that you were writing history that was still playing out. Now, I think everybody who's a historian whether you do medieval Europe, colonial Latin America, whatever you do, you're doing history that is in some sense still playing out, right? So I want to be very clear, right, that historians aren't writing about some sealed off past, right? They're talking about a particular moment in a stream of time that flows to the present,
Okay.
no matter what. However, right, it is certainly much easier for somebody who's writing about drugs in the early 90s to be very cognizant that what I'm writing about is still playing out in as you say, in real time. And so I have always tried to be thoughtful about how the work I'm doing can have implications for what we think about contemporary drug problems, contemporary drug policy.
And maybe we can just dive in it. Is those times, those periods when your research work starts playing out? Do you do you pick a period and just go on from there, or do you just take the whole? Because when I think of history of drugs, I can imagine many significant events, right? Maybe and I think you've written about those different ones. For example, the prohibition,
sure,
or the 60s with the psychedelic drugs, or the war on drugs in the 90s. So there has been many significant events. So maybe we can take back first a couple of sentences of how do you see it and how do you begin to tackle it?
Sure.
And then you can just dive in through whatever your area of expertise is and tell me the whole story.
Well, so that's right. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Let's just say you woke up one morning and said, "Well, I want to research the history of drugs." Well, it's too big.
Yes.
And I always, one of the things I enjoy when I teach undergraduates and we have a research paper is let's say I've assigned a 10-page research paper, and somebody will come to me and say, "Well, I want to write about World War II." And I say, "Well, no, you can't do that." And they say, "Well, I have 10 pages." And they say, no, you'd be surprised, right? In other words, these are big topics.
Yeah, okay.
And the drug war is this big topic. It's so multidimensional. I began where I did because that's where somebody asked me to.
And where did you begin
with the legal history of cocaine in the United States?
In the United States, okay.
Yeah, and that was to be very honest, I started there because somebody asked me to start there, and somebody said, "We'll support your research, but we need you to find out what happened in the United States during that period of time after the drug cocaine was introduced widely into medical practice, and the time where effectively the prohibition of the drug began." And this is simplifying it a little bit, but that's about a 30-year period.
Okay, and when exactly was it?
Right. Sorry. So cocaine as a drug, if you think about it as a presence in coca leaves.
Okay.
Right. Well, we've used cocaine in a sense, certainly coca, for longer than recorded history, right? So it's been used a long time. The identification of cocaine as kind of an active ingredient in the coca leaf and its chemical isolation happened much later, right, in the 1800s.
Okay.
But even then, it was identified, but as with any drug, simply isolating it doesn't mean anything unless somebody comes up with something to use it for.
Fun to do with it.
And that's where we can really date this very specifically, because it's 1884 is when the first really significant breakthrough research on cocaine happens. And it happens in Europe, but it travels to the US very, very quickly, and it's a medical sensation.
Okay.
Right? Really is.
And I think you described that in the book, right? That
Absolutely.
It started as some sort of medical.
It was.
wonder.
It was a wonder drug, you know, and so it was a medical sensation, and you can really date that very specifically. You can see in 1884 that's happening. And in 1914, 30 years later, Congress passes the first comprehensive drug prohibition legislation, if you will, the Harrison Act, right?
Okay.
Between 1884 and 1914, you have this 30-year period when cocaine, to some degree or another, is legally available. And what I was asked to do was very simple, which was to find out what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Find out what happened when the drug was legally available. So that's what I set out doing. And my areas of interest, after the publication of that book, I've moved on in other areas. But that was the first major thing that I studied.
Could you shed a little light on what happened? Like,
why? Of course.
What was the purpose of the medical use of cocaine?
Yeah.
And why did people thought it was useful, and how, like, what consequences the use of the drug made it so that people started shifting their minds and think of it as something dangerous?
Cocaine's an interesting drug, and it has some effects that are very obvious and immediate. And to put this in context, it's important to remember that if we travel back to 1884, the medical profession, right, had relatively little that it could do to alleviate the suffering of patients, to cure disease. I mean, it's interesting because in 1884, the field of medicine is really on the cusp of some major breakthroughs in coming. I mean, the century that followed, right, is an amazing century for medicine. But in 1884, any doctor found themselves struggling to do much to address patient complaints or issues. Okay. So what can cocaine do? Well, there's really two things that are very significant. The first is that cocaine is a topical anesthetic.
Right.
That's sort of obvious now, right? But it was the first real topical anesthetic, which meant that if you, for example, applied cocaine in solution to, let's say, the human eye, you could perform operations on the eye without the patient feeling it.
Okay.
And I don't know if you want me to be too graphic here, but
you can be as graphic
prior.
as you want.
Okay, well, so I want your listeners to picture this. Prior to 1884, if you needed to operate on a patient's eye, you had to do it while they were awake.
Okay.
Because the only anesthetic that was available to you would be something like ether. And there was no real way for a patient who had been anesthetized with, let's say, ether, there was no real way for the patient to remain still. In other words, a patient on ether might twitch or flinch or spasm or move. And if you're operating on the eye, it's probably obvious, but that's not a good thing. And so often what would happen is that patients would remain awake for these procedures, and a handful of strong attendants would hold the patient in place, and the operation would proceed as quickly as possible. So when Karl Kohler, who's an Austrian physician, identifies the topical anesthetic property of cocaine and demonstrates it, the reaction was a sensation, right? Because he was able to demonstrate that by putting some drops of cocaine solution in a patient's eye, they could remain awake while something was being done and they didn't feel it. And this was incredible. You just have to think about what kind of a sensation that must have been to see that happen. Well, that alone, I think, would have made cocaine the wonder drug of the 1880s. But of course, cocaine, that's not the only effect that cocaine has. Cocaine is also what we might call a euphoriant, right? Which means that it produces a kind of sense of well-being or euphoria in its users. And here too, right, doctors found this to be a very compelling effect that it could have on patients. So if you had a patient, for example, who was depressed, right, who was withdrawn, you could administer this drug to them and you would immediately see a change in mood. And that was pretty powerful as well. So, as so often happens with wonder drugs, the excitement and the enthusiasm gets out ahead of what might potentially be negative consequences for the drug. But effectively, the story that you see with cocaine is a story of how drugs are developed, a story of how wonder drugs are created, a story of the process by which doctors and pharmacists and patients, frankly, right, embrace this new drug and embrace its utilization, but also the way in which gradually the drug takes on a more sinister sense. And I don't mean necessarily in reality, but certainly in perception, right? Okay. It relatively quickly in this 30-year period goes from being a wonder drug to public enemy number one, a social problem. And so my research was also about the process by which that happened.
And what was it? Some sort of people liking the effects during the operation and it kind of like continue doing on their own time?
Well, so it was, there's a couple dimensions to it, right? So first, the drug moves beyond the boundaries of medicine, right? In other words, as you're suggesting, ordinary folks start to say, well, this is pretty good. I like this, right? And so, for example, patent medicine companies, these were companies that produced medicines for over-the-counter sales. They were called patent medicines, but basically they were just direct-to-consumer products. Patent medicine companies realized that a topical anesthetic would be great for people, let's say, with hay fever, right? Because let's say your nose is stuffed up and itchy and you feel lousy, maybe it's allergy season. you take a cocaine snuff and it opens your nasal passages and it numbs them and you feel better. And pharmacologically, it makes perfect sense, actually. So companies start cranking out these home remedy products containing cocaine for folks. Well, it's not surprising that as these become more popular, some people just decide that they're just enjoying it. Right? Not just when they have hay fever, but maybe when they don't, because it produces an effect that they find pleasurable. So the story of cocaine moving to prohibition is partly about its popularization outside of medicine and the ways in which doctors and pharmacists and even drug companies started to worry about that. Like, we need to put things back in the box, so to speak.
So what were the negative consequences? Like, because so far it has been like pretty good. Like, people kind of like getting good medical consequences and even liking their own the effects.
So some of the so why is the reaction happening, right? Why do people care that this is becoming popular? Right? Why does that cause them concern? I would argue, I'm going to give you 3 reasons. Okay. The first is something I alluded to, which is just professional, right? Where doctors or pharmacists say, hey, hold on there a second. It's okay for us to prescribe, but it's not okay for you to just go running around and using it, right? So there's some of it is just boundary setting, right? Where professionals are saying, hold on. This isn't just something for you to go get and to use. We need to control it so that it's very limited to our authority. That's one reason. A second factor is that, there are negative consequences. There can be, right? Some people take too much, and have a negative reaction or a kind of overdose reaction to the drug, and this was happening. Some people clearly became dependent, in some sense, on the drug. And there were stories of people who, kept consuming and kept buying, and it sort of took over their life, right? They neglected their work, they neglected their family, and they just fixated on the drug. And I don't want to deny that those things actually happened. They did. And there were certainly plenty of published accounts of people who either had negative reactions to the drug, who became dependent on the drug, maybe whose behavior became unpredictable or concerning while they were on the drug. These things did happen. And so that's a second dimension of concern. But the third dimension is important too, which is that there were concerns over who was taking the drug, right? That recreational use of cocaine not only was bad because it wasn't under the authority of a doctor or a druggist, but recreational use of cocaine by certain groups or classes of people became a concern. And this is where I think it's important to acknowledge, that there's a long history, for example, of racism, in how we respond to drug problems. And there's simply no question that the cocaine problem, the sense of seriousness that people had about it, had at least something to do with the fact that many of the new users were, working class, they were young, they were, young, urban, working class users are always going to be a concern to people. And then, of course, there were African-American users of the drug. And there was a deep strand of racism that went into how people responded to what was happening. So it's
But for example,
yeah,
what would the problem be with young people taking a drug, or like
it's
what's
a problem we have with young people anytime, right?
okay?
Which
It's more like a
is
bias towards young people. It's like they're
well, I mean,
having too
look,
much
you know,
fun,
when
kind of
you're
thing.
all right. Let's just say you're living in I don't know, Chicago, for example, right? Well, you know, young working class men, for example, are already a group of people you worry about, right? How do they behave? You know, are they acting appropriately? You know, would we
Okay.
worry about that? And now you add, now all of a sudden they're buying these, you know, hay fever cures and sniffing them and enjoying the effects. You start to worry and say, oh, if this is something that kind of person likes, I bet this is going to be a problem. Because what are they going to be like? We're already suspicious of them. We're already worried about them. Now they're taking this drug. Now what's going to happen? You know, what's their behavior going to be like now? And when you had this same phenomenon with African American users, very similar sort of thing, right? In a deeply racist society, if you perceive cocaine use to be prevalent among black users, you begin to, all of your kind of racist assumptions and concerns start to project onto the drug.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what are our black users going to be doing under the influence of this drug? How are they going to behave? You know, what's and there were stories, most of them apocryphal stories, but there were stories about, you know, African Americans under the influence of cocaine who were, you know, became, you know, undertook criminal acts or became violent, or who had like super strength and police bullets couldn't take them down and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And we can look back on it now and see what was at work there. But, you know, it felt very real for people. And so all of these strands come together to produce effectively the prohibition of the drug.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe also we can jump towards more modern era,
Sure.
because I'm curious what, since time has passed between that period and now, we've come to understand a lot more about the drug, what the effects on the people are, and positive and negative. And so is there I imagine between that and right now, there has been also like important time periods. For example, maybe the war on drugs, would you call it the most significant important period specifically to cocaine? Like the war between and the whole influence of, for example, Latin American countries, right? Like the influence that Colombia took, and now the people are very aware of that because of Netflix movies and Pablo Escobar and
Right.
like Narcos and all that. It's kind of more prevalent to people's minds. So how has been that transition, and like what has been the effect overall of the drug to people?
You know, there again, it's another big question.
Yeah.
You're very good at those. Yeah. I mean, so the, you know, the story that I told about cocaine is in many ways the story about the precursor to the modern war on drugs. Right?
Yes.
And so as that's the curtain kind of falls on that story, and then there's 100 years to come,
right,
of
time.
drug control and drug war. And one of the things you alluded to, the way in which cocaine implicates really all of the Americas in different ways. One of the things that's become much clearer to me and more obvious since I wrote the cocaine book was the extent to which these are really global stories.
Okay.
And you know, it was even then, but I historians have become much better at telling global stories about specific drugs and about the drug war, and cocaine's a great example of that, you know, where we've done much better at studying the dimensions of the cocaine experience in producer countries like Peru and Bolivia initially, and of course Colombia. In in countries that exist along the pathways for drugs like cocaine. So, for example, the impact in the Caribbean or the impact in Mexico. You know, I mean, I will say this: what prohibition brings is the rise of global illicit industry.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And that's an incredible story all of its own.
Right.
And it's had such a profound impact on so many countries. And, you know, I think as historians, as we move forward in talking about drugs, thinking about drugs, writing global histories is going to be increasingly important.
Right. So you would, in your opinion, just the fact that it's illegal makes it available for those type of illicit industries to just be emerged, and
Sure.
all the baggage that comes with them, like the violence and
Absolutely. It's
the economy itself, right?
no question. I mean, the creation of illicit markets around cocaine, around opiates, heroin, you know, specifically for the longest time, is such an important story in the history of drugs, and the transformations that illicit markets have wrought on whole societies are remarkable, you know, and it's illicit markets generate an enormous amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
They generate an enormous amount of violence.
Yeah.
They sustain an enormous amount of corruption. They are so significant that they impact entire national economies.
And generations, right?
Yeah, I would say so. And so the illicit markets are just so profoundly interesting as historical phenomenon, because they have such a profound set of impacts and consequences over time. And you think, for example, about the way in which illicit production, you know, has shaped the history and the trajectory of producer countries.
Yeah.
You know, it's an astonishing story, right? And it's shaped by the individuals that are part of the illicit economies, but it's also shaped by places like the United States, right? Which not only generate much of the demand for these drugs, but also lead a global policy regime, right, that produces some of these consequences of illicit markets. So many of the harms that are produced by illicit production are felt close to the site of the production, but the causes are truly global.
Right.
You know,
right.
I mean, and that's...
Yeah. And on that side, for example, I've been I've been thinking that it has been interesting because I am from Venezuela, and I think I've kind of seen firsthand the effect of the war on drugs. For example, not of course with my generation, but my parents' generation. So you can see most of Latin American parents' mindset about drugs. It's instantly something negative. It's like something and something to be afraid of. Like it's because they lived through it, right?
Yeah.
And I have family that have lived in Colombia that has been directly affected because of the war on drugs. For example, like all the kidnappings and all the violence against people not necessarily related to the industry, but just happens to have caught on the crossfire, right? And I think it has been interesting to see the effect on the mindset of people that, for example, my parents are completely against drugs, and most of my friends' parents, and they don't even like consider any medical application towards them, just because they've been it's been such a negative consequence in their immediate life.
And you can and it's, as you point out, it's understandable. If you've
Absolutely.
lived through, or if you came, let's say you came of age, as they did, right? In this era of profound instability, much of which was connected to the drug trade and the way in which the drug trade undermined governments, generated violence. I mean, these are, if you've lived through that, then it's not surprising, right? That this would leave an indelible imprint on who you are and the way you think about drugs. And you probably have a lot less room. This is not a criticism, but you have a lot less room for nuance.
Yeah, I think so.
when discussing drugs, because of that feeling, know, that you have, that's from your own lived experience. At the same time, though, I'm sure there are others in their generation, right, who also recognize the ways in which, for example, the United States is implicated in those experiences.
A rabbit hole in its own, right?
It is.
Understanding the dynamics between how the United States policies have affected other countries.
Yeah.
Because in my understanding, like United States, for example, funded a lot of these crackdown against drugs, right? And you could argue, have those policies to prevent drugs even worked or made it worse, right?
It's so.
I really don't have.
To your first point, you're exactly right. I mean, the United States is implicated in the way the drug war is being fought in Latin America in a couple of ways. I mean, one is the United States helped produce the international legal environment, right, which kind of compelled countries to wage war on drugs within their own borders in order to be consistent with the global legal regime, right? To be consistent with United Nations drug enforcement standards and what the US is wanting. But it's not just that, right? The United States also directly funded and supported anti-drug efforts that had profoundly impactful, right? And these range everything from defoliation efforts that had environmental impacts to anti-drug funding that looked a lot like counterinsurgency funding, but was being done in the name of fighting drugs. You see this in Colombia, right, where there's a lot of money being pumped into the Colombian government, which they're effectively using to fight, right, insurgent groups within their borders. But from the U.S. point of view, it's anti-drug money. And so in all of these different ways, the U.S. is implicated. And so I would say that for folks of your parents' generation, many of them are going to have a very kind of anti-drug bias because there's a deep sense of resentment over the impact that the drugs have had. But I think for others of that generation too, though, there is a feeling that some of this has been inflicted on them by the United States and by the kind of anti-drug regime of the United States.
Yeah, so we can start, I think, at least touching on then how, if we were the United States, how we would have acted, for example, and how do you deal with this problem, right? Because it's kind of a difficult problem, right? I've been thinking about it, and I don't think it's as easy as, for example, one proposed idea that people have is just legalize all drugs. Maybe like regulate them in some sort of manner so that even though they're legal, they can be safe and stuff like that. But I am definitely conflicted in that idea, right? I haven't really thought of myself of a good solution because, for example, there are, in my view, negative aspects that drugs can happen and can bring to people. So it's difficult to really give them to people so that they behave as adults in a way and consume them in a adult way, because drugs, you just to have the argument, just to set the argument of why would you want even to do that. Like, for example, coffee could be considered a drug, right?
Of course,
as your definition. So it's even a legal drug.
Yeah.
And alcohol, of course, has been legal legal, right? Because it's like minors cannot take it. You cannot take it while driving. Right. So there has been some regulations. So how in your view do you think of these problems of
I'm not a policy person, but I've obviously thought about it deeply over the years, and I think the way you talk about it is a very thoughtful way to talk about it, because I think anybody who talks about it in very simplistic terms is not being honest about it, because it is complicated, right? And I think it's very natural for you or for anybody to have this kind of, well, gee, on the one hand this, but on the other hand this, and to feel as though it seems complicated, because in truth it is complicated. As you point out, the mere fact of legalization doesn't necessarily eliminate some of the problems associated with drug taking. I mean, alcohol is a great example.
Yeah,
right? I mean, alcohol,
which is a very big problem, right? And
it's and
tobacco, for example, very big
sure. Tobacco, which is another very popular psychoactive substance, right? There's no question that legal tobacco, very lightly regulated for many, many years, produced an enormous amount of harm.
Yeah,
right?
like
we know that.
Millions of deaths, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we know that it did, right? Tobacco is not exactly an advertisement for how well legalization can work. And alcohol, again, is very heavily regulated, as you pointed out, right? The drinking age is just one of many sets of rules about how alcohol can be bought and sold and distributed and so on and so forth. So there's certainly a lot of regulation, but harm for sure. There are, people who are problem drinkers. There are people who drink too much in one night and have alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, and they can die, for sure.
Absolutely. There are people who drink and drive and crash their cars or worse. And so certainly there are negative externalities to taking almost any substance. And legalization with regulation, they don't necessarily eliminate those. When we think about reforming drug laws, one of the easiest ways to think about it is to think about, or reforming drug policy. One of the easiest ways to think about it is to think about it like this, right? There are harms that are associated with drugs, okay? There are harms that are associated with drugs. Some of those harms are what we might call intrinsic harms, which is to say that they are deeply related to the substance itself. Okay, so to use an example, a tobacco user, let's say they smoke a couple packs of cigarettes a day, every day for years, right? That's legal. They can go to the store, they buy the cigarettes, they're not at risk for being arrested, anything like that. But there are some intrinsic harms that are associated with that. Among others, a significantly increased risk of lung cancer, for example. Right? That's a good example of what we call an intrinsic harm. And whether it's legal or illegal, that's always going to be there, as an issue. And that's why policy around smoking has very much focused on those kinds of intrinsic harms and how do we mitigate that, right? Another one is the impact of secondhand smoke, right? There was a time when you could go to a college class and the professor would be smoking in front of the room, have an ashtray next to the podium. Maybe his students would too. I don't know. But these days, that's impossible to imagine, right? Because we have banned smoking, let's say here at the University of Florida. You can't even smoke outdoors on campus. And that's all to try and mitigate the potential harm of secondhand smoke to other people. So intrinsic harms are one kind of harm that's associated with drugs. But there's another kind of harm, and that's what I would call extrinsic, right? And extrinsic harm is a harm that is associated with the drug-taking behavior, but it is not intrinsic to the drug itself. It's a product of the environment in which the drug is being used, okay? So we take another drug. Let's use cocaine as our example, okay? If somebody is using cocaine, but it's laced with fentanyl, and they have an overdose because there's fentanyl in the drug, they didn't know about it, that's not intrinsic, right? That's a product of buying drugs on an illicit market and you don't know what you're getting. And that's that comes along with criminalization, right? So if that happens, that's extrinsic. Let's say the user gets arrested because they've got drugs on their possession and they're convicted of a felony and they go to prison. That's a harm, but it's extrinsic to the drug, right? I mean, it's part of the environment in which they exist.
It's just the violence that come with gangs and stuff like that. And extrinsic
You
harm.
name it. With gang violence, arrests, imprisonment, any of these are all extrinsic harms. To me, drug policy ought to be in the business of trying to reduce harm. It's a very simple way of putting it, but I think it's
extrinsic and intrinsic.
Right. There are times when the policy itself is what is creating or magnifying the harm. Let's take the opioid crisis, for example. Right? One of the most significant ongoing harms in the United States is overdose deaths. It's absolutely staggering human toll that's, as we speak, right, is happening in the United States. Overdose sounds like something intrinsic.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways it is, right? I mean, the effect of, let's say, oxycodone, or other kinds of opioid drugs on the system is such that if you take enough, it will, your system will shut down, your respiration will be suppressed or shut down, and you will overdose and you will die. But it's also true that the environment in which users are consuming drugs can greatly exacerbate the extent and the scope of overdose as a problem. And so what we need to think about from a policy standpoint is, what are the things that we could do? Let's just continue to use this example. What are the things that we could do that would help us minimize this particular harm, overdose deaths? And how can we direct our efforts and our energy to doing that?
Yeah.
Can we make things like Narcan more available, right? So that in an event of somebody overdosing, a friend or a family member could revive them and save their life because of the availability of this drug. Can we, for example, make fentanyl test strips more available to people, so that if you are a recreational cocaine user, you can test what you're using before you use it to see if there's fentanyl in it. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying these are simple or uncontroversial policy positions.
Yeah.
But if you're asking me my view,
yeah,
I think that centering the reduction of harm is always a good approach to policy.
I agree. And it even gets more complicated if you think of, for example, the game theoretic dynamics between I legalize it and I prohibit the use of this, and just because I prohibit the use of this, people would want to do it, right? Or even the other side of I legalize it, and since I am I'm in a way saying it's okay, or I'm not going to pursue you if you take it.
Yep.
I am encouraging the use of drugs, and people are going to use it more, right? So those two things.
Now, and of course, these are empirical.
People are complicated. Yeah,
they are. That should be the title of your podcast.
Yeah.
People are complicated. I think those are empirical questions. With the legalization of marijuana that's happening, right? This is a very interesting question. What kind of impact is that going to have on patterns of use? And I can't say that I'm an expert on it, so I don't want to affirm too much, but I would think that in states that have legalized marijuana, what you want to be looking at is, have we seen an increase in harms associated with the use of the drug? And are those increases in harms sufficient that they outweigh the reduction of harms that we've enjoyed from the legalization itself? Because let's be clear, right? The legalization of marijuana reduces all sorts of harms, right? Everybody who would have been arrested, charged with a crime, maybe charged with a felony, right? Who may have gone through the dislocation and the disruption of their lives because of that. All of the expenses that the state would have undertaken to arrest and to prosecute, and none of that's happening.
Yeah.
Right? That's a reduction in those harmful consequences.
Absolutely.
Plus, the state gets to tax the drug, and they make money off of the taxation. And so, in fact, not only are we not spending this money, but we're making more money. Then the question is, okay, but are we seeing new harms that are so significant
Yes.
that we want to stop? And I'll be honest with you right now, I don't think we are.
Yeah, and yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to look at. It would be more like a big study of data and looking at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think maybe we can at least stop for now. It's already
very good.
really late, but I do want to continue if you don't mind. So maybe we can pick another time and just like continue the conversation.
Sure.
Would that be okay for you?
Yeah, well, happy to do a part 2 at some point in the future with you.
All right.
Very good. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. You're asking me my view.
Yeah.
I think that centering the reduction of harm is always a good approach to policy.